be live. Hola, cage fighting connoisseurs. This is KidNate of BloodyElbow.com, joined by special guests, authors Bo Duer and Brian D'Souza. Bo, welcome.
Thank you.
And which books do you want to plug? What websites do you want to plug? You do Sports Meridian. Where else are you writing these days?
All of them. Let's see. I'm actually working with your buddy Eugene over at Aussie.com.
Very cool.
Of course, I think when it comes to MMA stories, they're going to go to him first, and so I've been doing Winter Olympic stuff there. The big MMA project I have right now, I wrote a book on The Ultimate Fighter, finished it last year. It's been sort of in limbo. It looks like it's picking up a little bit now, so that might still see the light of day. And yeah, and those are the two big ones, unless you want to hear about my women's soccer book.
Well, burnishing your credentials never hurts, but what's your Twitter so people can know where to follow you?
Dure Sport, D-U-R-E Sport.
All right, and Brian, author of
Pound for Pound, The Modern Gladiators of Mixed Martial Arts. And it's been called one of the best books on George St-Pierre, in your opinion, one of the best behind-the-scenes books on George's financials, management.
And MMA anywhere. Of the business aspects of MMA, it's by far the best book I've read.
And, of course, I write for Cage Potato, and you can read my thoughts on George's retirement a little bit later. So, I mean, that's coming out.
And so we are here to talk about the shocking announcement of Friday of last that George St-Pierre, the UFC welterweight champion, would be renouncing his belt and taking an indefinite leave of absence from the sport. Bo, I didn't see a lot of mainstream media coverage on this. All I saw was Fox News, the Fox News empire pick it up. I didn't see much on Sports Illustrated, ESPN. What do you think the story is there? Was that a lack of interest, or was that just a reflection of a short notice, badly handled press event on a Friday?
A combination of things. Short notice, of course, NFL season in full swing, and the NFL is such a bear right now. That's the sort of thing. It's the same reason nobody watches MLS Cup. Any other sport is fighting to get a scrap of interest at this point. And I think also it's just perhaps people who are, you have to bear in mind that there are a lot of editors making decisions on coverage who don't quite know the ins and outs of MMA. They don't really know the impact of what GSP is saying. The writer might know, the editor might not. And those are, having been in that situation, being a reporter at USA Today, as that happens now, these days USA Today is more MMA junkie, and so that's going to be a different story. But I can see that happening in other outlets as well, where people say GSP's saying this guy's sort of retiring. We don't know what to do with that. So yeah, I think it's all those things, and then it also adds up to the UFC maybe not being the big dog it was a couple of years ago. I mean, this is this is probably, and I'm sure hardcore fans will just shudder to hear this, but I think within the mainstream media, this would. George St-Pierre retiring is less interesting to them than Brock Lesnar retiring.
I can definitely see that. Brock Lesnar was like a comet that blazed through the skies of MMA. Brought a huge fan base from the WWE, and it seems like he took it with him when he left. Brian, what do you think? Do you think? Are you hearing anything from GSP's camp? I know you've got a lot of contacts with his management, his training, various people throughout his career. Was this something that was expected? I mean, we'd been hearing about it for months. Zane Simon and I did a show, Immediate Reaction, on Friday, and Zane was saying, hey, yeah, his guys have been saying for months that he was going to retire after this, or that he might retire. But do you feel like, are you hearing anything? Was there an element of him deciding, was it up in the air until UFC 167, then he almost lost to Johnny Hendricks, and then Dana White was, frankly, terrible to him at the press conference. Was there any element of him being pushed out by the UFC or mad and leaving in a huff?
No, not at all. George is very methodical. His whole team is very calculating. The number one question is his business relationships and his teammates' relationships with the UFC. Doesn't matter how nasty the UFC is, they hold all the cards. If his teammates, Rory McDonald, any of Faraz's guys, want anything, they got to play nice. So George wasn't pushed to retire. It's a question of traumatic brain injury. He's at his limitation, and he knows that if he doesn't move on now, he risks damaging his brain and his reputation.
I see. And so, do you think that the close call he had. This was his first split decision victory over Johnny Hendricks in a fight many people thought he lost. Do you think that played a factor? Do you think he was chased out of the division to a certain extent by Hendricks?
Absolutely. Tim Marchman of Deadspin talked about in his last 3 fights, George took, as much punishment as for the majority of his fights, So a tremendous amount of trauma to the head. And, fighters he knew like his own body. They calculate, every aspect of his game. So Hendricks was a factor in this.
And so, Bo, what did you think of Dana's treatment at the UFC press conference at 167? And also, didn't you think it was interesting that Dana White, the day before the retirement announcement, is coming out and saying, this is nothing, I think he's opening a mall. And then the next thing we hear from the UFC is, hey, we've got a call with Dana White and GSP, please join us. How do you imagine the behind the scenes of that taking place? Was that a lot of stressful, sudden conversations with GSP and Dana White and the Fertittas?
Can anything that Dana does really surprise us anymore? I remember it was strike force. Oh, I hate those guys. They're impossible to deal with. Oh, we're buying them. Oh, they're doing a great job. I mean, it's just things change just like that in Dana White's world. And so in that respect, nothing really surprises me. I think he's someone whose emotions sometimes get ahead of his reason. And so in that sense, I guess I wasn't too surprised that he was angry about the fight, angry about the decision, and just thought, I don't want to, I'm mad, and that's about it. And so he tends to forget that, when he steps back a little bit, Dana might not admit to this, but I think he was probably embarrassed by how he acted at the press conference, and probably went, my guess, and Brian may know more here than I would, of course, but just guessing from a distance is that Dana probably went back a little bit behind the scenes and tried to smooth things over a little bit after all that happened.
And ask Brian about that, because at one point, one of GSP's his mentor said, yeah, Dana did call and apologize. Dana immediately came out and said, I did not apologize. But then at the press conference on Friday, or the press call, he seemed a little bit like he was eating his words a little bit and saying, yeah, I've said bad things, but hey, I've been his biggest supporter, and so on and so forth. What's your take, Brian, on the Dana GSP camp relationship? Did they patch that over, or?
My honest take is George St-Pierre is a people pleaser. He's always going to say whatever needs to be said to make things good. You're not going to see him spin off and have antagonism like Randy, like Tito, like Rampage. Christophe Madou is GSP's mentor, and Dana likened him to Kim Kardashian. Very hurtful words. This is someone who mentored GSP and helped him get in the fight game and helped him make millions for the UFC and Dana White. Dana cannot show weakness with anybody in this game. If he does, the fighters will take, and their management will take advantage in the sense they'll ask for more money or more respect. Once Dana loses that kind of power over people, he doesn't know where he's going to stand. So I don't think he'd like that rumor coming out that he was nice or tried to patch things up. It's much better. This whole thing is about Dana White appearing in control of GSP's retirement notice, or that it isn't even a real retirement. That's the main issue.
So both of you, and you first, Bo, what do you think the odds are that we see GSP back in the octagon in 18 months with a record-breaking deal, a new contract, big raise, better money for sponsors, et cetera, et cetera? What do you think the odds are?
My impression of GSP is that he doesn't want to go into the cage unless he is at top form, and I don't know that that's going to happen. I mean, we all get old. I mean, I'm in my 40s. I know how it feels. And if you were an elite athlete like GSP was, and Chael Sonnen paid him a really high compliment by saying that for all the Olympic athletes that Chael trained with at some point, that GSP was the greatest athlete, and from what we've seen of his training, that's believable. He's not that guy anymore. And the sad thing is, when you get in your mid-30s, you don't stop being that guy and then start being that guy again. It doesn't happen. And so I'd be a little scared if he came back, honestly, at this point. I would worry that he was doing it for the wrong reasons. I would worry that maybe he was worried he was running out of money and had to come back. And it could be a very sad thing to see him come back. I'm sure he could come back and beat most of the people in the welterweight class, but to see him, I I think if he were to fight Hendricks again in 18 months, I don't think he stands a chance.
And Brian, before you answer that, I want to ask you: will GSP be running out of money? Are his sponsorship and management deals such that he's not sitting on as much money as Dana White would like us to believe?
Every fighter, it's event-based, so he makes money the same way Floyd Mayweather or Manny Pacquiao make money when they have fights. Their sponsorship's tied to their visibility. He could still make some after and post-retirement. Depends on his name value, his brand value to Canada, you know. And unfortunately, in terms of his management, he's paid out huge percentages. Who knows what his tax situation is? You hear Nick Diaz talk about not paying taxes, but George has probably paid out a lot. So I'm sure he's okay there. But who really knows? We won't know until 10 years, 15 years from now if we see some headlines.
Will you be personally surprised if in 18 months George St-Pierre is making moves and making gestures that indicate kind of, hey guys, I'm out of money, I need a fight?
If he comes back, it would be for the glory. It wouldn't be for money. I think he could survive on, he paid off his parents' house. He has property in Montreal, so he could survive and not need to be one of those people blowing millions like Mike Tyson in the limelight. So if he does come back, it'll be like Sugar Ray Leonard or something like that.
So MMA payout in the immediate aftermath of the announcement, they came out and said that GSP in the last year and a half has been averaging 250 to 300,000 more buys. When GSP's on the card, the UFC sells almost 250,000 to 1/3 more pay-per-views than they do without him. With Anderson Silva and Ronda Rousey fighting at UFC 168, both of those people could lose. Ronda Rousey could jump off to Hollywood. Anderson Silva could retire. That basically wipes out a wave of stars that the UFC has ridden for years. Bo, I mean, is the UFC going to be desperate and making GSP big offers to come back in 6 months, and 8 months, and 10 months?
It wouldn't surprise me if they threw some money at him, but Dana has always stood pat on the notion that he's never going to push anyone to fight who doesn't want to, and also Dana, to his credit, has been willing to let people go. In fact, he even sort of pushed Chuck Liddell. And there's no question that Chuck Liddell could have done 2 or 3 more pay-per-views and drawn fans. It would have been at the expense of his long-term health. He probably wouldn't have looked very good in those fights. But sure, he could have tried him out there for money a few more times. So I don't think that that's necessarily Dana's style. Now, it just leaves, but the issues facing the UFC are real. I mean, and you go to, I saw GSP fight a couple of times, covered those fights, and the crowd response, I mean, it's just the GSP chant. I mean, it rings in your ears almost as much as the Baba O'Reilly montage. I mean, it's really good, loud, building, shaking roar that comes in for him. And that said, I think that's diminished a little bit because he hasn't finished anybody in a long time, hasn't won convincingly in a long time, and I think now people are skeptical of him, even the casual fans. I mean, I think hardcore fans have probably seen this slip. They've looked at those stats about the punishment he's been taking, and they realize that he's not dominating the way he used to. But I think even the casual fans now are starting to see it, and in the wake of the Hendricks controversy over the decision, I think people realize that he's not the same guy. So even if you did trot GSP out for another couple of pay-per-views, unless he were to come back and surprise us all in spectacular fashion and smash somebody good in his comeback, then I don't really see the point in pushing him to do it.
Brian, when you hear about GSP's retirement, do you think, and the fact that, as Bo mentioned, that his last series of decisions hurt his brand value with hardcore fans, do you feel like that was a conscious decision he made to fight more cautiously and take less chances? And do you feel like that he could have taken a different path and not damaged his brand with that cautious style of fighting? Or do you think he was doing the absolute best he could, and that's just the way the ball bounces?
I truly believe he did the best he could. And that, he minimized the risks. It's like love, once you've had your heart broken, you don't love the same way again. Sarah smashed him in that fight, knocking him out in 1 round. And he came back, and his mind worked differently. And his new style was effective. And, there's no going back. It's like Lennox Lewis did the same thing, came back, used his height, used the jab, and it was very effective. For George to consciously change his style, fighters just really they can't do it. Maybe for a couple rounds, fighters can't consciously change their style. It's like Ben Askren. He can't become exciting. He is who he is, and we should really respect the fighter's skills and what's going into it.
Now you bring up Ben Askren, and this is going to go off topic from what we talked before, but I'm going to surprise you with this. Bo, the UFC just refused to sign Ben Askren, a former Olympian, undefeated former Bellator champion, and a former college rival of Johnny Hendricks in his college wrestling days. I mean, when Ben Askren, when Missouri would wrestle Oklahoma State or they would meet at a tournament, that was a big deal for wrestling fans, and that's a sport that's growing in popularity. Do you think they made a big mistake there by letting Ben Askren get away? I know he's born in the octagon, but outside the octagon, he is Mr. Personality, Mr. Trash Talker. He's got a good look. He can sell fights. Did the UFC make a big mistake there?
Yeah, I think so, and I understand the reluctance because we're in an era right now in which we have, as Junie Browning would say, that great prophet, a lot of boring wrestlers. And there are a lot of boring MMA fights right now where they're just clinched against the cage and not doing very much. And I think that's turning off a lot of the casual audience, and so maybe that's why they don't want to make a big push over someone like Ben Askren and try to sell, and because they know they can't really sell him as exciting. But then again, this is the sort of thing that my old colleague Sergio Nan used to say, there are some people who always got to pass on doing exactly the same thing. Randy Couture wasn't always the most exciting fighter. And certainly in the last few fights, GSP has not been the most exciting fighter. And so in that respect, I sort of look at Ben Askren and compare him to some of the people who are in the cage right now and say, well, he's as exciting as these guys are, and he's better. So given that, you need to bring him in, especially since Dana has always said these are the major leagues. The UFC is the major league. Everybody else, whether they like it or not, is minor league. Okay, that's a bold, rude thing to say, but if you're going to say it, the thing you really have to do is back it up, and that means sometimes signing people who, the championships are not always the most exciting. The Super Bowl is often not the most exciting football game of the year. The World Cup is often the most boring soccer game of the year because everyone's scared to make a mistake. And so, that's something that you have to deal with if you're going to put on the highest level. And so what you got to do is be creative and make, if your main event's going to be Askren versus Hendricks and people might be bored by that, well then make your co-main event something, Ronda Rousey beating somebody she can easily beat up. You've got to find a way around it and just deal with the fact that, hey, sometimes your best fighters aren't going to be the most interesting. You just have to balance it. Have Tom Lawler do difference for him. I don't know. Dress it up somehow.
Brian, I want to give you a slight twist on that. What do you think the impact of the combination of not signing Askren and GSP suddenly taking a leave of absence? I'm not going to say the retirement word, but taking a leave of absence and renouncing the belt. What kind of ripple impact is that having on MMA managers and agents around the business?
I couldn't answer that, but what I would tell you is Askren, if he became champion, the pay-per-view numbers would plummet. And then the UFC is very cognizant. They know about these business forces. And in terms of management, it's just not smart management. You have people in it for themselves and giving away way too many rights, way too many things to the UFC. I think if the pay-per-view numbers take a dip, people might start to work together a little more and might see that common ground of holding the line almost. But people are in it for themselves. If you're Johnny Hendricks management or even Robbie Lawler's, you're not going to care. You're going to be happy that you get the belt and get to call yourself the recognized champion, even though none such exists.
Well, Bo, we talked a little bit about the specter of Anderson Silva losing at 168 and Ronda Rousey, and you talked before the show how GSP is kind of at the back end. GSP and Anderson Silva were the second wave of UFC stars in the U.S. You had the original Chuck Liddell, Randy Couture, Tito Ortiz, Troika, Matt Hughes, and Rich Franklin to a lesser extent that were the initial wave of UFC popularity in 2005, 2006, 2007. Then you had GSP and Anderson Silva come along right under them, and they were the champions that UFC fans learned to love. And then you had Brock Lesnar come in like a comet from the WWE, brought his fan base with him, then left and took his fan base with him. Now, if Silva and it seems like they've anointed John Jones and Ronda Rousey as their new wave of stars, are those two enough to carry the UFC, or are they in for a transitional period?
They're in for a transitional period. It's to some extent, you look at the wave of casual fans who've come through, and it's kind of like when you discover a band right around their 8th album or so, and everything they did up to that point, that's brilliant, because you're sort of looking at it with hindsight, and or if you start watching Saturday Night Live, they go, things were great in the Belushi era and so forth and so on, and then they start bringing in these new people, and you go, wait a minute, who are these new people? I don't know if I like these new people, and so you end up kind of stuck in that trap. Well, the new people, how do you make a name for them that compares to the old people? And it takes a long time. I mean, how long was Will Ferrell on Saturday Night Live before people realized, oh my goodness, this guy is one of the all-time greats on this show? And that's what's happening with the UFC. I mean, it has taken a long time to get John Jones any sort of recognition. John Jones has skills that are off the charts. I mean, how would you put John Jones in his prime up against Chuck Liddell in his prime? And
John Jones would have killed him. I mean, it would have been brutal
exactly.
and ugly.
Yeah, I mean, and Hoist Gracie. I mean, if you put Hoist Gracie in the UFC today, everyone knows how to neutralize all those jiu-jitsu tricks, and they're going to pound him out like Matt Hughes did. And so it's a really difficult situation. You can bring in better and better fighters, and the only ones who stand out are going to be the ones with the brash, perhaps obnoxious personalities like Lesnar or Rousey. And then the rest of it, they just have to be patient. I think over time, people will start to see, and we're starting to see that with the Fox shows now, where the Fox ratings seem to be creeping up a little bit. People tuned in to watch Mighty Mouse, and then they saw a pretty surprising finish from Mighty Mouse over the weekend. And so then maybe those people say, well, okay, the next time I watch the flyweights, maybe I'll give them more of a chance, because maybe they actually can knock each other out. So yeah, they're going to have to be patient and realize that there's no quick fix. They're not suddenly going to have 5 mega bouts in a row. It's not going to happen that way. I mean, you have the next heavyweight bout should be good. Again, people may be interested in Mighty Mouse again. John Jones has looked mortal now. He looks human. So perhaps that might bring people in. But there's no quick fix anymore. There's not going to be. It's hard to imagine a Brock Lesnar scenario repeating. It's hard to imagine a Ronda Rousey scenario repeating. Those are all the accents, and you can't force those things to happen. It wasn't. No one said, "Hey, let's create this show called The Ultimate Fighter, and let's have this finale where these two guys who are likable guys fight the most epic 3-round brawl in history." You can't plan that. You basically have to be patient and wait for things to come up that you can write. And you hope that the UFC realizes that they don't try to push something that doesn't exist. They don't try to push Johnny Hendricks into being something he's not, or push Michael.
Well, let me raise that question, because Johnny Hendricks is somebody in college who was an infamous heel. This guy had amazing anti-charisma. I mean, college arenas would fill up when Johnny Hendricks was wrestling, just on the off chance of seeing him lose, and they would rarely get to see that. I mean, that rarely happened in Johnny Hendricks' career, but fans loved to show up and boo Johnny Hendricks. Johnny Hendricks gloated when he won. He would go to go to somebody else's campus, beat their best guys, and then rub the fans' faces in it. Where is that Johnny Hendricks, Brian? Do you think Johnny Hendricks has a chance to emerge as the new heel of the UFC, or does he just not have? Does he have limited star potential, or could this guy be somebody big?
The combination of the new Fox Sports 1 deal and the departure of many long-standing stars, the decline of the Ultimate Fighter, they don't bode well for the pay-per-view numbers that John Jones, Hendricks, or even Ronda can make now. or Chris Weidman if he becomes champion. Well, becomes a dominant champion, I mean. So I mean, these outside factors are pivotal. There's Brock Lesnar was built up for the WWE. George St-Pierre fought really well, and he was finishing guys and stopping them or submitting them. Beat Matt Hughes. Had these tremendous resume of names. Beat BJ Penn. There's nothing like that for Ronda to do. There's no one really established that she can scalp. Cyborg's not in the UFC. They would have to build someone up totally from scratch, like Holly Holm or something, or bring people in. So I mean, it really is going to be very difficult for these stars. And Hendricks, can he break 300,000, 400,000 pay-per-view buys? I don't want to speculate, but it's really gonna take a tremendous effort to turn this around right now because the UFC is in decline.
Bo, traditionally in combat sports, what you want is an orderly transition. You want the man to beat the man. You had it with GSP. He had a classic series against Matt Hughes where he came close but lost the first time, came back and destroyed Matt Hughes the second time, and put a nail in Matt Hughes' coffin the third time. Johnny Hendricks did not get that chance. Some people believe he beat GSP. Many people believe he beat GSP, but he didn't get the title. He didn't get the belt. When people look back at the records, they're going to see split decision loss to GSP. Is Hendricks' brand permanently damaged with casual fans? Are they ever going to get past that, well, he didn't really beat GSP feeling?
Well, one thing is that, it's one thing to be a jerk, it's another thing to be a boring jerk. And, Brock Lesnar was not a boring jerk. In fact, Brock, to some extent, really wasn't a jerk. He was a complex guy, and that's true of Ronda Rousey as well. And it was even true of Josh Koscheck. These guys they can play the heel, but they're complex. I don't see that with Johnny Hendricks. I see a guy who's just so full of himself that it may have cost him the GSP fight because he may have gone to the fifth round thinking, oh, I've got this. I can just sort of trot around and do whatever I want. Well, what does Dana White say? What are the words on the hallway in The Ultimate Fighter? Never leave in the hands of the judges. And he fought a stupid fifth round. And so you might say, well, statistically he didn't deserve to lose, and by any other measure he didn't deserve to lose, but maybe just in terms of karma he deserved to lose. And so, it's hard to feel sorry for Johnny Hendricks in that respect. Now, maybe he sort of grows up a bit and starts to realize that he has to do a little more, not just to be a champion, but to be an interesting champion. The guy he's fighting for the championship is not the most interesting guy in the world himself. And again, these are situations you can't force. There's one other aspect worth bringing up in terms of these transitions, and that is that for years the UFC had the luxury of having people who were built up elsewhere. They bought pride, and then you had these people like Dan Henderson or like Rampage Jackson, and you could bring them in, and they were legit. And the UFC had no trouble saying that even though these guys fought for another promotion, these are some of the best in the world. And so when Rampage beat Chuck, well, Rampage was legit. When Anderson Silva beat Dan Henderson, well, that Henderson was still legit and became someone else they could bring in. And then Strikeforce brought in some people who were legit. WEC brought in some people who were legit. So they've had all these ways of bringing in outside people to come in and jump up to that star level. And now what do you have? I mean, we're wondering about the transition from college wrestling, but it's a different sport. It still is. And college wrestling is still a different sport. Its fan base overlaps with MMA, but it's not quite the same. And we see some college wrestlers make great transitions and some don't. And so it's not quite the same as having a Pride champion come in or having a Wanderlei Silva come in. And so in a sense, the fact that the UFC has buried everybody else and put them all on the tombstone, that Dana carries around, in a sense, that tombstone has become a millstone because now they can't. Now they don't have those outside organizations to build these guys up anymore. Unless you count Bellator, and
we've seen how that works.
Those have that has its own issues. Yeah.
Brian, do you think there's any way for the UFC to dig themselves out of the hole they've dug by trying to monopolize the sport? I mean, I agree wholeheartedly with what Bo is saying because fight sport ultimately is an illusion. it's creating the illusion that these are the two most dangerous men in the world, or the two most dangerous men in their weight class. And somebody like Nick Diaz, who objectively never was that successful in the UFC, became a major league star who moved the needle on pay-per-view by having 3 or 4 years of exposure on Showtime and CBS against fighters, frankly, that weren't that great but were exciting. Guys like Cyborg, guys like Paul Daly. Can the UFC create that with a shadow alliance with the World Series of Fighting, or are they just running out the string on this game?
Because the personalities involved, because the Fertitas and the Dana and the way they think, they will not absolutely take the risk of opening up, letting some competition act as a feeder league. When you have feeder leagues, Bo really hit the nail on the head, like Pride, getting the best guys from Russia or Japan. You know what I mean? They're finding these Fedors or finding these guys because it's a statistical game. So the more money that's coming in overall, Strikeforce found a few great prospects, or they helped a guy like Nick Diaz become more marketable. You know what I mean? It's a statistical game, and even if the UFC is this globally dominant company with fight promotions in every country or Ultimate Fighters in every country, it simply won't work the same way. I don't see how they can cover all the bases, and because the personalities involved, too much ego involved, too much desire for control, they want to speculate and buy up everyone's futures, buy up their likeness rights, everything in perpetuity. You know what I mean? They don't want to open up enough. There has to be money in for other people. It has to be worth it for someone to have their own show or other businessmen to have a product they can take pride in, which Showtime certainly did with Strikeforce. And I just don't see – the UFC would have to undergo like severe catastrophic failures financially for them to turn the ship around.
And Bo, you had talked before the show about international expansion as being the UFC's ticket to growth. You feel like the North American market, particularly the Canadian market, just took a huge hit. You feel like that they're going to be able to make that trapeze swing, ride the fad in Brazil, a few more years, expand into Europe, expand into Asia, maybe even South Africa. Is that going to work and then wait for the wheel to turn and get popular again in North America, or are they not going to be able to pull that off?
I think they'll be able to pull it off to some extent, and I think that, again, the question is how many times you can go to the well, and the first Ultimate Fighter in Brazil, by all accounts, was a smashing success. The second one, not so much, and so I think, particularly with the Ultimate Fighter is one of those things where the more you do it, the tougher it is to do. I mean, you end up with seasons like, I guess, maybe Tough 15 or so, where it's just the winners end up being guys who've been turned down 3 times in the past because they keep going back to the same weight classes and so forth. The most recent Ultimate Fighter was more interesting because you had all these women who had pretty good resumes. It was a clash of sort of the old guard like Baszler and Roxy with some of the newer ones, and they found some good new talent in there as well. And that's what you had on some of the old Ultimate Fighters as well. I mean, the heavyweights brought in Roy Nelson, but then once you do that in the U.S., then you turn around and you have no names again. I think the way to keep the Ultimate Fighter fresh is to keep going to other countries. I mean, I'm kind of surprised that they insist on doing a domestic version as well as an international version every season. It seems like they ought to go somewhere else in the first half of the year and then come back to the U.S. or something like that. So they're always keeping it fresh. There's always a new angle. I mean, the smashes, the Britain and Australia one. Maybe they didn't find a lot of great talent, but it was kind of fun to watch. It was different, and that may not be a smash on Fox Sports 1, but you broadcast in other countries, show it on Fox Sports 2. The hardcores will watch it, and then come back in the fall with another domestic Ultimate Fighter, and then you have. So I think there's really potential there, not just to grow internationally, but keep adding to. Keep adding to the base. Eventually, they're going to have to turn somebody good from one of these shows. They don't seem to have done it so far. The Tough Brazil guys have had kind of a rough go of things, but eventually, maybe they'll find some great guy in China or something like that. Maybe they'll find the next Korean Zombie somewhere. Somebody who may not draw 1 million pay-per-views, but it's a good fighter, and build them up through the Ultimate Fighter that way.
Brian, the next season of Ultimate Fighter in the U.S. is going to feature strawweight fighters, women, coming over from Invicta. Do you think that women's MMA is going to be the UFC's big push in the U.S. for the next few years? Do you think that's their biggest opportunity, or is there something that I'm missing?
It's an experiment, and it's based on Dana. They're very calculating for Tina's and data. They saw like Strikeforce had some success with women's divisions, and it wasn't such a huge risk to get these fighters. But Ronda was on a pretty good card with Lyoto Machida and Dan Henderson, if I recall. So whatever her pay-per-view numbers were, she benefited from that, and whatever the build-up can be with her opponent. Straw weights, lighter weights. The lighter weight guys haven't really done well with the UFC. We haven't seen Jose Aldo break out and become this huge star. And remember, it's better for me that the UFC is successful and that these fighters do draw huge pay-per-view numbers. It's better for all of us. I love to be optimistic about the women's division. So, I mean, it's possible they'll try and get some play, get some different type of coverage. There's the novelty of it. There was always the novelty of the UFC, of Ultimate Fighting in the earlier days, like from 2005, I mean. Like, it could get media coverage based on the novelty. That's what they're trying to recapture. And, or the sideshow of James Toney versus Couture. Now we're talking about Roy Jones. That's a good idea. I commend Dana and the UFC if they match Anderson and Roy Jones. Because the novelty of fighting is a great thing.
Yeah, I have to applaud that, and I think the Bellator really blew it, that if they had booked Rampage Jackson and Roy Jones, A, that fight would have happened, and B, it would have happened on pay-per-view, and C, it would have sold pay-per-views, and people would have seen Eddie Alvarez and Michael Chandler, and Bellator would have been transformed. And I think they really blew it by thinking inside the box and going back to the well with Tito Ortiz, who was utterly a spent force. But that's Bellator's mistakes, and that's the kind of mistakes that UFC has not made historically. And one more question, Bo. Are we seeing the end of the pay-per-view era? The UFC's revenue reportedly is almost 30 to 40% TV rights now with the Fox deal. As pay-per-view erodes, not just because of the lack of stars in the UFC and the lack of interest in MMA, but also because the medium itself is getting close to its sell-by date with more and more people streaming illegally. Internet pay-per-view has got enormous technical hurdles in front of it. Do you think we're going to move to a rights-based era? Can MMA make that transition, and can the UFC get us there?
It's hard for me to imagine a world with no UFC pay-per-views. I still think that they can occasionally do the heavy-hitting card where they have the next heavyweight title bout, perhaps with another title bout, another division. Particularly now that they're going to have so many divisions. I mean, for years they got by with 4, then 5, then 7, and now it's 10. So they can do a couple. You can put a couple of title bouts, one really big one, on a pay-per-view, and then maybe they cut back to where they're only doing maybe 4 pay-per-views per year, and the rest of it is on TV, and that seems like a good mix to me, because to me, especially now that I'm not covering it on a weekly basis like I was from 2007 and 2010. When I see a pay-per-view and then I see the promos, the endless promos in these pay-per-views for everything else that's coming up, and I think, oh, there's another one in 2 weeks? I don't know if I can make it down here to the Green Turtle to watch this one, or come up with a way to watch this. And so, I mean, I admit I skip pay-per-views a good bit these days because there are just too many of them. And it's just too much to ask for me to either come up with a ton of money, because I don't have a lot of MMA watching friends. Sorry, I don't do the pizza party and have that stuff in my house. We'd probably wake up the kids, so I have to get out to a sports bar basically and go watch it. And I don't want to go out to a sports bar every other week from 10 p.m. to 1 a.m. to watch a show. So I think it's a good thing. I think it's good that they have a stable deal with Fox. It's good the ratings are ticking up a little bit there, and it's good that they're able to run some more of their programming on there. It was recently they had a really good card. I forget which one it was, and because they all run so quickly, but then they pretty well immediately tossed it out again on FS1 or FS2, and so it's a treat. You have so much space there, and so I think I think it's a good thing, but yeah, I still think 3 or 4 years is a good idea.
Brian, one last question. When you hear talking about the UFC segueing and getting away from pay-per-view and moving to their new digital network, do you think there's any chance, are we ever going to see an MMA union? Are fighters and managers ever going to get organized? Are you hearing any whisperings of that kind of stuff? I mean, now they've got kind of an opportunity because the stars are dead, and the stars have been probably the biggest limiting factor. If you couldn't get GSP or Anderson Silva in a union, you don't have any leverage. Now it's a blank slate. Is there an opportunity for a union, and will that opportunity be seized?
You know, there's a famous study about people in the middle of disasters, like on a sinking ship or something, and it's shown that there's a lot of people who will just stand there and do nothing, even when they're about to die. They won't do the most obvious thing and jump in a lifeboat. That's the best metaphor with the fighters. They just don't have the instincts. They're conditioned from all sides to sign the piece of paper in front of them, and really, someone really powerful would have to enter the picture, whether it's the managers themselves or television networks or somebody where like John McCain would have to come along and then herd the fighters into a course of action, because fighters are driven by emotion, by fears. They're fighting mainly because of codependence. They're trying to prove something to somebody, prove that they're not afraid to the point where they would sign any deal. They don't know the value of their self-worth. George St-Pierre rarely knew what he was worth financially. Maybe he still has no idea, which is why so many people have taken him and taken advantage of him. And I'm not optimistic, but if something's going to happen, somebody really powerful, even if it's the MMA media, the managers, one of the stakeholders who makes money off of MMA has to step forward and, you know, push it forward, just like the Fertittas have done with their agenda. They've put their money in to legalize MMA in Ontario and in New York. Why? Because they can benefit from it. We have to think the same way, but the fighters don't think this way. They're content to get picked off one by one.
All right, and my closing thoughts on this, I mean, I think we've seen a huge pivotal moment in the history of the sport with the retirement of George St-Pierre. This is clearly the end of an era, and it's happening at a time, as we pointed out, where so many other things are changing. The pay-per-view audience is eroding. GSP is just one of a wave of stars that are fading. There's the stars coming up behind him are much less than the stars that they're going to be trying to replace. And the UFC has created for themselves a worldwide near monopoly on the sport, and that has ironically hurt their ability to create stars because they don't have the opportunity to poach these new organizations. Any parting thoughts, Bo?
Yeah, I would say that the sport's actually in pretty good shape. I mean, you look at where they are now. If you had said to somebody in 2004, hey, in 2014 you're going to have this deal on Fox, and Fox is going to have 2 sports networks, and you're going to be some of the primary programming on those networks, I think people would have said, wow, that's fantastic. And so I think really the question is expectations, and just realizing that this may be a sport that goes through peaks and valleys, and it's better than it was in 2004, not as good as it was in 2009, and that's okay. And they have to now. The question is, will Dana, the super aggressive triumvirate of Dana and the Fertittas, be able to manage the sport that way and to temper their expectations? Maybe dial back a little bit on this is going to be the biggest sport in the world stuff. It's not. Sorry, I'm a soccer guy. It's not going to be the biggest sport in the world. It's not going to be bigger than soccer, and but that's okay. And you look at boxing right now. Boxing isn't as big as it was in the 1950s, but that's healthy. There are people making a living in it. There are people you've never heard of making money in it, so that's pretty impressive. As opposed to MMA, where you still have people who you think are big stars and they have day jobs, and so I think it's still a pretty good time in the UFC. It's just a question of making sure that they understand where the growth potential is and where it isn't. So as long as they do that, the UFC should be fine. If not, the UFC will implode, and then you'll see a race of about 30 people trying to jump into the void.
Brian, any parting thoughts?
GSP was one of the greatest fighters of all time. We got to give him his respect so he doesn't feel he has anything to prove in a year or in 5 years. And he's very sensitive. So guys, if you write anything, you talk to people, just remember, he was really, really good, really great. and he's going to read your comments, read your articles, or hear what the fans are saying. So give him his respect. He was one of the best of all time, if not the best.
Absolutely, I think that's a great note, and let's all give a salute to George St-Pierre as we wrap this up, guys. Thanks a lot for being on the show. Hope to have you back again soon. And adios, MMA aficionados. This is Kid Nate. Remember to subscribe on YouTube to MMANation.com and get every one of these episodes. Follow me Twitter at Kid Nate. Bo, where can they follow you on Twitter?
Dure Sport, D-U-R-E Sport.
And Brian on Twitter?
Thracian_books.
All right, and we'll be back. I'll have the usual previews for UFC 168 coming up. Things will slow down a little bit for the holidays. Adios, MMA aficionados.